with us today, especially so many years after our first Enigma interview. Let's start today by talking about your journey to success and how your childhood dreams affected where you are today.
Thank you so much, Yasmine. And yes, I think the interview was in 2015 or so.
Yes,
So it's been quite some time. But the initial story stays the same. And it was at the age of 7 at home. My father's colleagues, all professors, they would be discussing national security and policy in the evening. And then the next day, I would see them either on TV or writing an article in the newspaper or on the radio. And to me, it was fascinating to see regular people at home. But then the next day, everything they said was heard. There was a lot of dependence on dialogue. And one thing that they all had in common was that they all had PhDs.
Wow.
So my childhood dream at the age of 7 was to have a PhD.
That's amazing.
So it was having that degree so that you're credible, so that people can, you're an expert in the subject matter, and then you can be heard in trying to shape policy. As time went on and graduated from the American University in Cairo, so I didn't want to fulfill that dream. And I was on a flight to the US, did my master's and PhD. I finished at the age of 25. And then during my time as a PhD student, I did an internship, one at the World Bank, one at the IMF. And I was really fascinated by the IMF as an institution that directs financial stability, monetary policy, dialogue with the authorities. So right after, I joined the IMF for several years and then was called on to come back to Egypt to the central bank. So it was a combination of being surrounded by those who value education, seeing the value of education as a license to have influence, but based on competence. And then the journey of getting the degree, practicing in one of the very biggest institutions globally. I think those brought me very much close to the dream.
Of course, that's amazing. When you moved to Egypt for the central bank, did you see that would be a life move, or were you looking at it as something temporary that you were going to do for a while?
The dream is always to equip yourself with competencies and skills and exposure to what's happening globally, but to be able to implement them in your own country. That's the ultimate objective always, be it at the central bank, which was very close to my studies and my work at the time. Later on, after finishing at the central bank, 11 years of work, putting together monetary policy frameworks for inflation, discussing, going through 2008, going through the revolution. So I spent between 2005 and 2016 at the Central Bank of Egypt, and then was called to go back to the IMF to actually use all the operational expertise at the central bank with the academics that one knows to be able to implement them in other countries. So it was a fantastic way to equip yourself with a very hands-on experience on monetary policy, financial stability, go back to the IMF and work with other countries to actually guide that implementation. And close to 2 years later, called back to Egypt to serve as Egypt's first female Minister of Tourism. At every point in time, it's really making sure that you are adding to the skill set, you are adding to the understanding of what's happening globally, but also in a very important country, in a very important emerging market, and what are the learnings and how there could be experience sharing with other countries, with other colleagues, and so forth.
Well, tell us about that call. You're at the IMF, you move back, and you get a call to become Egypt's Minister of Tourism. And that must have been...
It was very counterintuitive, not just to me, but to everyone who knows me. So it was a very interesting episode. I was here during New Year's of 2017, so it was New Year's Eve of 2018. And I spent New Year's Eve in Siwa, one of the most favorite spots to my heart. And it's a land where I feel that anybody's dreams can come true. So if anyone wants to make a wish, have it come true, visit Siwa.
Good to know.
You know, I finished my holidays here in Egypt, and then I was on a mission to Jordan, working with their central bank and their financial authorities on monetary policy. It's an IMF mission. I was leading the mission. And the last day of the mission, this was the 10th of January, I get a call from Cairo saying, we want you to come back to be sworn in. So I said, you know, sworn in for which portfolio? And they said tourism. I said, but tourism is not really financial stability and monetary policy and hardcore economics that one has studied and practiced. But they said, no, this is a sector which is 15% of Egypt's GDP, and we want it to be run from an economic perspective. Wasn't given much choice and was flown in the next day.
Wow.
And 14th of January 2018, I became Egypt's first Minister of Tourism.
Yes, and very first female minister
of Tourism.
I feel like you excelled so well. Yes, it's not your traditional background, it's not economics, but it's a role that you were like such a great, and you still are, such a great ambassador for Egypt and Egyptian women and showing the modern side of Egypt.
Well, that's where one's skills and education comes in. You get a portfolio that might not be very close to what you practice every day. So being a macroeconomist, you take a look at the sector and you try and see what needs to happen. So it took me a few months to understand each and every detail of this sector. It's one of the very important sectors, very intertwined with many others. And I put together the Egypt Tourism Reform Program. It's a structural reform program that identifies structurally what needs to happen when it comes to training, when it comes to investments, etc. And marketing and promotion is one of the key aspects of tourism as well. And that's where it was a fantastic opportunity to show everyone Egypt in a different way, and also a fantastic way to feel closer to my fellow citizens. And this is true for any country. Monuments and the Nile and this, everybody feels that they are Egypt's Minister of Tourism. Each and every person living in Egypt feels that they are the Minister of Tourism. When you're promoting the country well, you get an affinity with everyone. And that was one of the fantastic connections I had at the time. And it worked out, as you mentioned, very well. We ended 2019 with the highest revenues in Egypt's history. So there was so much talk about in terms of designing reforms, in terms of implementing, in terms of the marketing. And most importantly, using all the skills you learned from an economic perspective, apply them on a sector or at a micro level. And that's how good results came out.
That's amazing. And how did that lead into the new ministry now that I feel was created for you almost, right?
At the end of 2019, there was a cabinet reshuffle, and then I was appointed as Minister of International Cooperation, the ministry that is responsible for Egypt's economic diplomacy. We work with all international institutions with the exception of the IMF. So that's the only institution I do not work with directly. But the World Bank, the African Development Bank, economic relationships of Egypt with countries is also within this portfolio. It's a very important opportunity to showcase what the country is doing, how partnerships play a fantastic and a very important role to satisfy national goals, but also global goals. To be able to have an agreement on implementing a project with the World Bank or with US or with Germany, the institution and the country need to see eye to eye. The two countries need to have mutual understanding. So there's a lot of diplomacy, there's a lot of looking at sustainable development goals. There's plenty of effort in trying to find the common denominator that actually brings everyone together rather than the differences that might push us apart. I was sworn in at the end of 2019 and then COVID happened. So as the Minister of International Cooperation that needs to travel everywhere and create new partnerships, everybody was locked in their country. Nonetheless, this gave us an opportunity to put together what I call the principles of economic diplomacy. 3 principles: multi-stakeholder platforms, where we were able to collate all the partners online and discuss what needs to happen. For instance, at that time, health and vaccines is very, very important for all countries. So how we could work with the US, how we would work with other countries to avail the vaccines, and with the World Bank for the immediate response on certain financing and so forth. So multi-stakeholder platforms are a method to bring everyone together on the goals that we want to achieve. The second is SDGs are so important, and that was 2020, 10 years till 2030. So this was the decade of action. So what we did is take the financing portfolio with international cooperation, and this is the concessional finance with all the partners I spoke about, and we mapped them to the SDGs. So it was a very nice way, or in a different way, of saying rather than we have an agreement for $1 billion with this partner or 200 million with this partner, we say that our portfolio is able to achieve SDG 7 renewable energy or SDG 6. So it shows how the country is mobilizing external financing with development partners to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is what we call ODA SDG mapping. And then the third principle is creating a narrative around the partnership. Each and every project, each and every agreement has people at the core. It is projects in action, and these projects could be government, could be private sector, or a partnership. And then finally, purpose as the driver. Which SDGs are we able to fulfill through these projects? So this is what we called the principles of economic diplomacy, launched in 2020 and working until now. So it's been a very eventful 3 years as Minister of International Cooperation. There was COVID, followed then by the geopolitical situation that's happening in Europe now. But nonetheless, Egypt really believes in multilateralism, believes in international cooperation, and this was very, very evident during COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in November.
Which was a huge So let's talk about your role in COP27, because that put Egypt in a map in such a different way. Nobody had seen Egypt perform such a huge, successful conference before.
COP is the biggest gathering of stakeholders globally. So you have countries, which are governments, you have the private sector, you have international institutions. Climate objectives have become the key in design of any project for a country or for the private sector. Today, in order to access financing, you actually need to show how your project is sustainable or how it actually fulfills one of the climate objectives, either as a government, as a private sector, as an NGO. So this is one of the biggest congregations of bringing everyone together. There is a discrepancy between developed economies, which have already moved ahead with their development and have climate goals, and the developing world, which are still developing, and therefore they are suffering from the effects of climate change,
Yes.
nonetheless are required to do a lot to be in line with climate action. So this discrepancy requires financing. So one of the key roles that we played as Ministry of International Cooperation, given that we work with the financing world, the multilateral development banks and the bilateral partners, is how we can go from pledges to implementation. How can we show that many of the commitments made by developed countries to help developing countries, how can we make sure that they make their ways to projects that need them the most? In our role, our contribution were three. First, we launched the Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook for just financing. And this is a guidebook that actually tackles what needs to be done from each stakeholder to be able to achieve climate action. The second is we launched Egypt's country platform for the nexus of water, food, and energy, an Egyptian platform to bring in the commitments for climate action. And the nexus of water, food, and energy in Arabic is Nuwafi, and Nuwafi is Nuwafi, fulfilling pledges. So that was the concept, and now many countries want to do the same. And the third is we launched the first entrepreneurship and startup competition, Climate Tech Run. This is the first global competition in any COP. And the idea was to see how globally startups, the youth, are thinking about innovative ways to tackle climate action. I can go on and on and on because the preparation for COP and the outcomes of COP were extremely significant and important. But as you mentioned, showed that the philosophy or the thinking of climate in Egypt had taken place since 2014. And that's because we see that climate and development come hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive.
Amazing. You've achieved so much at such a young age. You probably were groundbreaking even in the IMF and the central bank in your positions. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges that you faced as a young woman in such positions of power.
Maybe it's the upbringing or maybe it's the persistence. I've never seen gender as a characteristic that should hold you back or push you forward. Competence is extremely important. So you never take anything for granted. You need to, even at a ministry level, you always have to keep yourself exposed to what's happening, be agile and flexible. So this is one of the very important to overcome any challenge.
Yeah.
Be it a man or a woman. Females should not feel held back by gender. Anyone who's adding something to the table, and to add to the table requires that you invest so much in looking around and trying to see how you can add value. So that's one of the key aspects. The other issue is you need to put your ego aside in many of what you do, be it within a team. This is one of the key aspects for success, regardless being man or woman.
Yeah.
That even if you know better, try and make sure that it's done in a way that is very inclusive. That is also what always pushes one forward. The other challenge sometimes that you feel that you may not be achieving as much as you want or can, that could hold you back in many ways. In those situations, gratitude becomes very important. So always see how much you've done and that there's always scope to do more, not to feel challenged or frustrated that you're not doing as much as you really think that you can achieve.
But the finance world and the world of politics, they're very male-dominated institutions. Do you ever feel like you have to work harder or you're underestimated? Or does that drive you to make even more of a difference?
In my case, raised to always be the first on the class, work so hard, ace your exams. So it comes naturally that you have to work hard. My experiences, and it's been in different institutions globally and nationally, anyone who has competency, is a subject matter expert, adds value, even if sometimes there's a difference in opinion of people with you, but there's an appreciation of what you add. I think that's what everyone needs to work on. What is it that makes you different in adding value to a discussion, to a project, to a cabinet, to a country? If everyone is able to integrate that in their psyche and in the way they decide what to do and how to move forward, that will help tremendously.
With such a busy and hectic schedule, what is a typical day like for you? When is the free time? What would do you do when you get that free time?
Catch up on sleep. One of the key challenges for us is being able to sleep well. Meeting friends is something that many people take for granted. And sometimes in busy schedules, and particularly in COVID, we take COVID as an example, created distances between people. Sometimes hectic schedules does the same. And that's why any free time, you need to make sure that you see the ones that matter to you the most.
Okay, let's do the Enigma Questionnaire now. Describe yourself in 5 words.
5 words. Can I do it in 5 letters?
Yes.
Rania.
Okay. Who is your greatest role model?
I've always loved growing up watching Kulthum because that visual, a lady standing with 40 men behind her. The recognition she got, the sustainability, the eternity that she brings, a fantastic role model when one looks at her story and looks at the detail and how much she also invested in her competencies and in a lasting legend forever.
Yes. When you're not working, what is the one thing that you like most to do?
Listen to music, have discussions with my mom and dad. When I'm traveling, spend time with my niece and nephews.
What would the title of your autobiography be?
I have one in mind. Once it comes out, then I'll let you know.
Okay. Okay. Favorite movie?
Ishaat Hub. I love that one.
What has been your proudest moment?
Every time I see that my mother and father are proud of me. These are very important moments. When I got my PhD, they were extremely happy. The first time I'm sworn in, when I'm doing well, they're very happy. Each time I feel that all their time that they invested has given them a sense of satisfaction and return, that makes me extremely happy.
What makes you laugh?
Silly actions, my nephew, Zain. He's extremely funny, so that makes us laugh a lot.
Okay, and last question. What's one thing you wish people could know about you?
Sometimes there's a perception always that if you're successful and you're a minister, you may not have a sense of humor, or I write poetry both in English and in Arabic,
Wow.
so that's one thing that people maybe don't know.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This
Thank
has
you,
been a
Yasmine.
great interview. Thank you so much.
much.